Okay, so are you ready to dive in today?
Always ready.
Because today we are talking about Eastern Catholic churches and this idea of a potential reunion in 2025 between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, huge topic.
Yeah, it is a massive topic, and we are looking at this paper.
It's a fascinating paper.
It is a fascinating paper. It's called Eastern Catholics and the Possible Positive Outcomes from Nicaea 2025.
And it really digs into some interesting history.
Yeah, and one of the things that it brings up right at the beginning is this idea that history might be repeating itself.
Right. These attempts to reunite Eastern and Western Christianity.
Yeah, because this isn't the first time somebody's tried to do this.
Not even close. So
Yeah.
there's a long history of these attempts going all the way back centuries.
Yeah, full disclosure for our listeners, we are talking about a split that goes all the way back to 1054, the Great Schism.
A major turning point in Christian history.
Yeah, the Eastern churches went their way, and the Western church centered in Rome went another way. But the paper goes beyond just the history of these failed reunions.
It really does.
It dives into how this potential 2025 reunion could really shake things up within Catholicism itself.
Particularly for the Eastern Catholic churches.
Yes, and this paper uses a very interesting term. It describes them as a sort of Trojan horse.
It's a provocative analogy for sure.
It is a provocative analogy. You've got to explain this one to me because I'm picturing like ancient Greeks jumping out of a giant wooden horse.
Maybe not quite that dramatic, but the point the paper's making is that Eastern Catholic churches, just by existing, challenge this idea of a single uniform Catholicism.
I mean, they are Catholic, but they've held on to a lot of their Eastern traditions.
Right. Things like married priests using icons in worship. Even some of their theology leans more Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, and that's what makes them a potential Trojan horse.
Exactly. They're part of the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
but they embody a very different way of being Catholic.
A way that's much closer to Eastern Orthodoxy.
Exactly. And the paper argues that this could undermine the Vatican's authority if there's a push for reunion.
So if the Vatican becomes more open to Eastern practices and beliefs in order to bring the Orthodox Church back into the fold, you're saying that traditional Catholics might see it as a threat.
Potentially. Some might even start to question the Pope's authority, which, as you know, is a pretty big deal in Catholicism.
Yeah, it's not a small thing.
No.
And the paper points to the Synod on Synodality as an example of this tension playing out right now.
The Synod is fascinating in this context.
Okay, so for anyone who's not totally up on their Catholic jargon, can you give us a quick breakdown of what this Synod thing is all about and why it's relevant here?
Sure. So the Synod on Synodality is basically this big ongoing conversation within the Catholic Church about how decisions should be made.
Who has a voice and how is power structured?
Exactly. And it's stirring up a lot of strong feelings because it suggests a more decentralized church where local churches and even lay people have more say.
Which is interesting because that's exactly what traditionalist Catholics are pushing back against.
Right. They see it as a direct threat to the Pope's authority and a move away from what they consider true Catholicism.
It's like this perfect storm brewing right as this potential 2025 reunion is on the table.
That's a great way to put it. And it's why this paper suggests that Eastern Catholics could actually be a major factor in how this whole reunion plays out.
They could either help bridge the divide or widen it even further.
Exactly. They're right at the heart of this issue.
So we're really starting to see how these Eastern Catholic churches are tangled up in this whole reunion question.
They're kind of a microcosm of the bigger issue.
Yeah, exactly. But before we go any further, I think it's important to acknowledge that their history with Rome hasn't exactly been smooth sailing.
Not always.
This paper dives into this whole concept of Latinization,
Yeah.
which sounds kind of intense.
It's a loaded term for sure. Basically, it refers to this pressure that Eastern Catholic churches have faced over the centuries to conform to Roman Catholic practices and doctrines.
You're saying they were essentially told to become more Roman to be accepted?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. To give you a concrete example,
Okay.
some Eastern Catholic churches were pressured to adopt the Roman Mass and abandon their own unique liturgies,
Wow.
which often had ancient roots and held deep cultural and spiritual significance for these communities.
So they're being asked to give up part of their identity.
In a way, yes. It was a
Yeah.
way of trying to create a more unified Catholic Church. But it often came at the expense of these Eastern traditions.
And it wasn't just about the Mass, right?
No, there were attempts to discourage married priests within Eastern Catholic communities, even though it's a long-standing tradition in Eastern Christianity.
It almost feels like saying you can be in communion with Rome, but only if you become more like us.
Exactly. And it created a lot of tension and resentment within these Eastern Catholic communities.
It makes you wonder if part of the resistance to the synodality from traditionalists comes from this fear of the church becoming less Roman.
It's definitely a factor. The author argues that for many traditionalist Catholics, this fear is rooted in a very specific view of history,
What do you mean?
one where the Roman Catholic Church is seen as the sole inheritor of authentic Christianity.
Which completely disregards the centuries of history and tradition that Eastern Christianity represents.
Exactly. And that's why this potential 2025 reunion is so significant. Will it reinforce this idea of Rome as the center, or will it be a chance to reimagine what Christian unity could look like?
Okay, so let's get into these potential paths forward.
Because the paper does lay out a couple of very different scenarios.
Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly.
All right, well, the first and arguably bleaker outcome is that Eastern Catholics are further absorbed into the Latin Rite, losing their distinct identity.
Losing their traditions, their liturgies, their unique way of expressing their faith.
It would all be subsumed by the dominant Roman Catholic culture.
And that would be a tragedy.
A lot of people would say so.
Yeah.
Not just for Eastern Catholics, but for Christianity as a whole. We'd be losing a vital and ancient expression of the faith.
It would be like looking at a tapestry where all the threads are the same color.
I like that analogy.
You might have unity, but you lose the richness and beauty of diversity.
Exactly. And I think it speaks to a broader concern about cultural homogenization within globalization.
Right. This loss of something unique and irreplaceable. Okay, so that's the doom and gloom scenario. What's the more hopeful possibility?
The other possibility, and the one that I think a lot of people are hoping for, is that Eastern Catholics actually become the key to bridging the divide between East and West.
They become like living bridges between these two branches of Christianity.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a scenario where instead of being pressured to conform, Eastern Catholic churches are seen as a model for how different expressions of Christianity can coexist within a larger unity.
Okay, I'm with you. How would that actually work in practice? What would it look like for Eastern Catholics to take on this bridge building role?
Well, for one thing, they could become centers for dialogue and exchange between East and West.
So they'd host theological conferences where Orthodox and Catholic scholars could hash things out.
Exactly. Engage in respectful debate, of course.
Of course. But it would go beyond just intellectual discussions, right?
Absolutely. It's about fostering genuine relationships, building trust, recognizing the shared humanity that binds us together as Christians.
It's about creating spaces where people can encounter each other's traditions not as threats, but as different facets of the same faith.
Exactly. And I think Eastern Catholic churches, with their lived experience of both Eastern and Western traditions, are uniquely positioned to facilitate that kind of encounter.
So in this scenario, instead of being pressured to conform, Eastern Catholic churches are celebrated for their unique identity and their ability to bridge the divide.
Exactly. And their experiences, including the challenges they face with Latinization, become invaluable in this process of reconciliation and rebuilding.
It makes you think about what Christianity could look like if it truly embraced this kind of diversity.
Instead of being seen as a threat, these different expressions of faith could enrich and strengthen the whole.
And who knows, maybe Eastern Catholic churches with their unique position and history are the key to unlocking that potential.
It's a powerful thought for sure.
But let's be honest, this more optimistic scenario hinges on the Catholic Church being willing to change, right?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
To let go of some of its traditional power structures and embrace a more decentralized synodal approach.
And that, as we know, is never an easy thing for any institution, especially one as old and as tradition-bound as the Catholic Church.
And that's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah, this whole question of whether the Catholic Church is willing to change.
It's not exactly known for being super flexible.
Well, institutions as old and as powerful as the Catholic Church don't tend to change overnight.
Right, they've got centuries of tradition and power structures in place.
Exactly. And the paper argues that the future of Eastern Catholic churches might depend on whether the church doubles down on that centralization or embraces a more decentralized synodal approach.
So basically, it's a tug of war between clinging to the past and stepping into a new way of being the church.
Exactly. And those Eastern Catholic churches, those Trojan horses, as the paper calls them, are caught right in the middle.
If the church decides to circle the wagons and reinforce that top-down authority,
then those Eastern churches might be pressured to assimilate even further.
Maybe even lose their unique identities.
Which be a huge loss, I think.
Yeah.
Not just for them, but for all of Christianity.
Right. It's like losing a whole branch of the family tree.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that question of what true Christian unity really means.
Is it about everyone looking and acting exactly the same?
Or is it about recognizing and respecting the richness and diversity of different traditions?
It's a question that goes way beyond any single denomination or tradition.
It's about how we understand the very nature of the church.
So for anyone listening who's feeling a little overwhelmed by all this church history and theology,
It can be a lot to take in, I know.
we want to leave you with this thought-provoking question.
Go for it.
What if the future of Christianity doesn't hinge on clinging to the past,
I like where you're going with this.
but on being open to the unexpected possibilities of the present moment? What if those on the margins, like the Eastern Catholic churches, have something essential to teach us about what it means to be a truly universal church?
What if they hold the key to a more vibrant and inclusive faith?
Exactly. Thanks for diving deep with us today, everyone.
Until next time.
Keep those questions coming.